A note to the reader. This book was written for the person who has already been through it, not the person anticipating hardship, not the person doing research from a comfortable distance, the person who knows from the inside what it feels like when the floor gives way. If that is you, if you are reading this from the middle of something that has shattered or humiliated or diminished you, then this book is written directly to you. Every page, every word. If you are past the worst of it but still carrying the weight of what happened, still rebuilding, still wondering who you are now that everything that defined you has changed, this book is also for you. And if you are reading this in a moment of relative stability, trying to understand a season that already passed or prepare for the storms that inevitably come, welcome. You belong here too. A few things I need to say clearly before we begin. This book does not minimize what happened to you. There is a genre of self-help writing that rushes past the pain to get to the lesson. This is not that book. What you went through, or what you're going through, was real. It hurt. It cost you something. Possibly everything. This book will sit with that before it moves through it. This book does not promise a return to who you were before. That person is gone. Not because you failed, but because pressure changes things. Coal becomes diamond. Steel becomes stronger at the fracture line. What comes after rock bottom is not a restoration. It is a transformation. And transformation, by definition, produces something new. What this book does promise is this. There is a path. It is not straight. It is not fast. But it is real. It is lit by the experience of millions of human beings who came before you. And you are capable of walking it. No matter how far down you fell. No matter how long you have been in the dark. Let's go. The ground you're standing on is not the end. It only feels that way from down here. Rock bottom has a way of feeling permanent. It doesn't announce itself as a temporary condition. It doesn't come with an expiration date or a guarantee that the sun will come back. It simply arrives, often without warning, and installs itself like it owns the place. You know what it feels like? The morning you wake up and the weight of everything wrong is the first thing your body registers, before you've even fully opened your eyes. The way an ordinary sound, a song, a notification, a knock at the door, can crack something open in you that you spent 3 days carefully sealing shut. The specific exhaustion of carrying something you didn't choose and can't put down. Rock bottom wears different faces for different people. For some it is financial, bankruptcy, debt so crushing it feels structural, the shame of not being able to provide. For others, it is relational, a divorce that dismantles an identity built over years. A friendship so betrayed it retroactively changes the meaning of shared memories. For others still, it is internal, addiction that has stolen entire years. Depression so heavy it makes the simplest actions feel heroic. A mental break so complete that the person you were before feels like someone you read about in a book. Sometimes it is all of these at once. Sometimes one thing falls and everything else falls with it, because we build our lives in layers, and when the foundation cracks, every floor above it shakes. What every rock bottom has in common. Despite how different the circumstances are, every person who has ever been at rock bottom reports the same core experience. Not just the same emotions, though there are those, but the same fundamental disorientation. The same sense of not recognizing the life you are living. The same question, asked in the small hours of the morning, that burns more than anything else. How did I get here? That question can go two directions. It can become a trap, a loop of self-recrimination and backward-looking blame that keeps you pinned to the lowest point like a butterfly pinned to a board. Or it can become a door. Not an easy door, not a comfortable door, but a door that leads somewhere other than where you are. The purpose of this book is to help you turn it into a door. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling said that. The woman who wrote Harry Potter, one of the most celebrated literary series in human history, said those words having lived them. She was a single mother on welfare, clinically depressed, in a marriage that had collapsed, her manuscript rejected by 12 publishers. She has described that period of her life as a genuine rock bottom, a time when she considered herself a complete failure by every measure she had been taught to use. She has also described it as the most clarifying experience of her life. The stripping away of everything that didn't matter left her with the one thing that did, the story she needed to tell. This is not an argument that rock bottom is secretly good. It is not good. It is painful and humiliating and costly and often unfair, but contains something that no comfortable life can provide: the absolute clarity of having nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing standing between you and what you actually are. The promise this book makes. This book makes one central promise, and it is not the promise most self-help books make. It does not promise that everything will be okay. It does not promise that your pain will transform into purpose within a set number of steps. It does not promise that if you follow a particular protocol, you will emerge from your rock bottom victorious, grateful, and Instagram ready. The promise this book makes is simpler and, I believe, more valuable. It promises to tell you the truth about what rebuilding actually looks like, about how long it actually takes, about what it actually requires of you, emotionally, psychologically, practically, about the specific lies that rock bottom tells you and why those lies are wrong, about what the people who came back from the deepest falls in history actually did to come back. Truth, in this context, is not a harsh thing. It is the kindest thing, because what makes rock bottom most dangerous is not the fall itself, but the stories we tell about the fall. The story that says this is permanent. The story that says I deserve this. The story that says people don't come back from this. Those stories are not the truth, but they feel like the truth when you're in the dark, and no one is telling you otherwise. Consider this book someone telling you otherwise. Let's begin with what rock bottom actually is, because the first step to getting out of any place is understanding exactly where you are. Chapter 1. What rock bottom actually is, and what it isn't. Before you can climb out, you need to know what you're climbing out of. Rock bottom is not the worst thing that has ever happened to you. It is the moment when what has been happening to you, or what you have been doing, becomes impossible to continue ignoring. There is a critical difference, and that difference matters more than almost anything else in this book. Bad things happen to human beings constantly. Illness, loss, failure, betrayal. These are as common as breathing. But not every bad thing produces a rock bottom. Rock bottom is not defined by the severity of the event. It is defined by the relationship between the event and your capacity to absorb it. Rock bottom is the point at which the gap between where you are and where you thought you would be, where you thought you deserved to be, where you had built your entire sense of self around being, becomes so wide that it can no longer be managed, minimized, or explained away. It is the moment that the story you've been telling about your life breaks beyond repair. The 3 flavors of rock bottom. In 15 years of research into human resilience and recovery, from addiction science to bankruptcy psychology to post-traumatic growth studies, 3 distinct types of rock bottom emerge consistently. Understanding which one you're experiencing is not just academic. It changes what you need to do next. The first type is the sudden collapse. This is the rock bottom that arrives without warning, or at least without the kind of warning we recognized in time to act on. A medical diagnosis, the sudden end of marriage, a business that was fine last week and isn't this week, a death that reorganizes everything. The sudden collapse is characterized by shock, a cognitive and emotional state in which the brain literally cannot fully process what has happened because there was no framework prepared to receive it. People who experience the sudden collapse often describe the first days or weeks as surreal. They function, they go through the motions, they say the right things, they handle logistics, but they feel as though they are watching themselves from outside, as though the person navigating the crisis is an actor playing them in a film about their own catastrophe. The second type is the slow erosion. This is the rock bottom that arrives after years of accumulation. Small compromises stacked on small compromises, patterns of behavior that were manageable once and are now not, a life built on a foundation that was always slightly wrong but close enough to function for a long time. The alcoholic who finally loses the job that had been the last thread. The couple who finally collapse under the weight of 1,000 unspoken resentments. The person who has been slowly sinking under the weight of a career that was never theirs to begin with and wakes up one day unable to go in. The slow erosion is in some ways harder to navigate than the sudden collapse because it carries more shame. The sudden collapse can be externalized. Something happened to me. The slow erosion implicates the self. I let this happen. That distinction, whether true or fair or not, creates an additional psychological burden that the person in recovery must navigate alongside everything else. The third type is the chosen demolition. This is the rock bottom that is, in some sense, self-initiated. The person who finally admits what everyone else already knew. The one who takes the action that ends the comfortable lie. Who leaves the relationship that was slowly killing them. Who admits the addiction. Who tells the truth that cannot be untold. Chosen demolition is still a rock bottom. The loss is still real. The grief is still legitimate. But it carries within it a seed that the other two types don't always have from the beginning. The seed of agency. You must make a decision that you're going to move on. It won't happen automatically. You will have to rise up and say, I don't care how hard this is. I will get up from this. Joel Osteen. What rock bottom is not. Here is what rock bottom is not. It is not a moral verdict. It is not evidence of your worth as a human being. It is not proof that you are always going to fail, that you are never as capable as people thought, that you fundamentally do not have what it takes. This needs to be said loudly and repeated often, because the voice that tells you otherwise is persistent, fluent, and completely wrong. The bankruptcy does not mean you are stupid. The divorce does not mean you are unlovable. The addiction does not mean you are weak. The mental breakdown does not mean you are damaged beyond repair. These things mean that you are human, that you are subject to forces, pressures, circumstances, and inherited patterns that overwhelmed your capacity to manage them at that time. That is an experience. It is not an identity. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison before becoming the first democratically elected president of South Africa. Oprah Winfrey was fired from her first television job for being too emotionally invested in her stories. Abraham Lincoln failed in business, lost multiple political elections, and suffered what modern psychiatrists reading his journals describe as clinical depression, before becoming what many historians consider the greatest American president. Steve Jobs was fired from his own company. The pattern is not coincidental. Rock bottom, entered honestly and navigated with intention, tends to produce the kind of person who can do the kind of things that a comfortable life never demands. Why naming it matters. There is a psychological concept called affect labeling, the practice of giving a specific name to an emotional experience. Research by Dr. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA has shown that the simple act of naming what you're feeling, not just bad, but specifically ashamed or terrified or grief-stricken, measurably reduces the intensity of the experience. The brain's alarm system, the amygdala, quiets when the prefrontal cortex is given a specific, accurate label to work with. The same principle applies to the situation itself. Naming where you are, I am at rock bottom, is not defeatist. It is clarifying. It stops the exhausting project of pretending the situation is something other than what it is. It creates a reference point, and it makes the next question possible. If this is where I am, what does that look like from here? You are at rock bottom. That is what this is. Say it if you need to. Write it down. Let it be what it is, without flinching or minimizing or explaining it away. And then turn the page. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Collapse. Why good people fall. The fall wasn't random. Understanding it is the beginning of rebuilding. One of the most painful aspects of rock bottom is the bewilderment. Not just the pain of the situation, but the confusion about how a person like you, a person with intelligence, with values, with good intentions, with a genuine desire to live a good life, ended up here. The bewilderment is its own form of suffering, and it is almost always built on a false premise. The false premise is this: that good people, smart people, well-intentioned people should be immune to catastrophic collapse. That falling as far as you have fallen is evidence of some fundamental character defect, some weakness or stupidity or moral failure that you either always had or somehow developed along the way. This premise is false, and not just a little false, comprehensively, demonstrably, historically false. The architecture of a life under pressure. Human beings are not built for the kind of sustained, compound pressure that modern life applies. We evolve for acute stress, the lion on the savannah, the threat that is immediate, physical, and temporary. Our stress response systems are exquisitely designed for that kind of challenge. Flood the body with adrenaline, focus the mind on immediate survival, then recover. What we did not evolve for is chronic stress, the kind that never fully resolves, that builds layer upon layer over months and years, that is invisible and social and financial and relational. The human nervous system under chronic stress does something that seems counterproductive, but is actually adaptive. It normalizes. It adjusts the baseline. It incorporates the stress into the background radiation of daily life so that you can continue to function. This normalization is a feature, not a bug, until it isn't. Until the accumulated load exceeds the structural capacity of the life you've built. And then, without warning, something gives. Engineers call this failure mode latent defect, a structural weakness that is not visible under normal load, but reveals itself catastrophically when the load exceeds a threshold. Bridges fail this way. Buildings fail this way. Lives fail this way. And the failure is never random. It always occurs at the point of the greatest structural weakness, under the conditions of the greatest cumulative stress. Understanding this is not about excusing what happened. It is about understanding it accurately, because you cannot fix what you don't understand, and you cannot rebuild on a foundation whose structural weaknesses you haven't identified. The 4 pressure systems. In studying the circumstances that lead to catastrophic personal collapse, 4 dominant pressure systems emerge again and again. Most rock bottoms involve at least 2 of these. Many involve all 4 simultaneously, which is precisely why the collapse feels so total. The first is accumulated loss. Human beings are remarkably adaptive in the face of individual losses. We are less adaptive in the face of compound loss. The death that comes in the middle of the divorce, that comes in the middle of the financial crisis, that comes in the middle of a health problem. Each individual event might have been survivable in isolation. Together, they exceed the system's capacity. This is not weakness. This is arithmetic. The second is identity erosion. This is particularly common in people who have built their entire sense of self around a single role or achievement. The high-achieving professional who loses their position. The parent whose identity is inseparable from their family, and whose family falls apart. The athlete who loses the ability to perform. When the thing you are is gone, the question, "Who am I now?" is not philosophical. It is existential. And the existential void is one of the most destabilizing conditions a human being can inhabit. The third pressure system is isolation. Human beings are social mammals. We are neurologically wired for connection. Our nervous systems literally regulate through proximity to other safe, calm nervous systems. Chronic isolation, whether physically literal or emotionally real, degrades psychological function in ways that are measurable and predictable. It increases paranoia, impairs judgment, amplifies negative emotion, and undermines the capacity for clear thinking. Many people enter rock bottom having been isolated long before the visible collapse, carrying burdens privately, maintaining surfaces while interiors crumble. The fourth is compounding shame. Shame is uniquely destructive among human emotions because it attacks the self rather than the behavior. Guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I'm something bad. And shame, unlike guilt, is not motivating. It is paralyzing. It drives hiding rather than healing. It makes asking for help feel like confirming the worst about yourself. It turns the very act of reaching out, which would be the most useful thing, into an additional humiliation. Many people collapse not because they ran out of resources, but because shame prevented them from accessing the resources they had. Shame derives its power from being unspeakable. That's why it loves perfectionists. It's so easy to keep us quiet. Breen Brown. What this means for you. If you are reading this and replaying the sequence of events that led to your rock bottom, the choices, the turning points, the moments where you went left instead of right, I want you to hold those replays loosely, not to dismiss them. The honest accounting of what happened and your role in it is important. It is part of the work, but the accounting must be honest in both directions. It must include the structural pressures that were operating long before the visible collapse, the stresses that accumulated without adequate processing, the inherited patterns from family, from culture, from circumstance that shaped the decisions you made, the isolation that prevented help from reaching you when help was available. You are not blameless. You are also not the monster your worst thoughts about yourself suggest. You are a human being who was under pressure that eventually exceeded the structure's capacity. The structure failed, and structures, unlike character, can be rebuilt stronger than they were before. Chapter 3. The Night Before the Morning. Surviving the worst of it. What to do when you are in the fire and the fire is not done with you yet. This chapter is for the people who are not yet on the other side. If you are reading this from a place of relative recovery, if the worst of it is behind you, you may find this chapter useful as a retrospective map. But if you are reading this while you're still in the middle of the darkest part, this chapter is written specifically, urgently, for you. The night before the morning is a phrase I use to describe the deepest part of rock bottom, the period after the collapse and before the first genuine signs of rebuilding. It is the period when the new life has not yet shown itself, and the old life is definitively gone. It is the in-between, and it is, for most people who have experienced it, the hardest place they have ever lived. I want to talk honestly about what that looks like. Not the sanitized version, the real version. Because the sanitized version is useless to someone who is actually in it. The physical reality of collapse. What most books about resilience skip past is the physical reality of crisis. And it is skipped past because it is uncomfortable to describe and because it doesn't fit the arc of an inspiring story. But it is real, and if you are experiencing it, you need to know that it is normal. The body in crisis does not behave like the body in a motivational video. It is heavy. It does not want to get up. Sleep, when it comes, does not restore. When it does not come, the night is a particular kind of long. Eating is sometimes impossible and sometimes compulsive. The simplest tasks, a shower, a phone call, a response to a text, can require more activation energy than a marathon felt before everything fell apart. This is not laziness. This is not depression masquerading as laziness. This is a body that has been through a significant trauma. The body processes psychological and relational catastrophe with the same biological mechanisms it processes physical injury. The stress hormones, the disrupted sleep architecture, the suppressed immune function, the cognitive fog. These are not failures of willpower. They are the physiological signature of serious stress. Understanding this matters because the voice in your head, the one that is telling you that your inability to function normally is further evidence of your inadequacy, is wrong. It is adding an additional burden to a body that is already operating in crisis mode. You do not owe your crisis a performance. The one-day rule. When you are in the worst of it, the future is not a resource. The next year, the next month, even the next week. These time horizons are too large to hold. Looking that far forward from the depths of rock bottom produces not hope, but overwhelm. Because the distance between where you are and where you would need to be seems uncrossable. The one-day rule is simple. Do not try to solve the rest of your life today. You are not required to figure out how you will rebuild everything. You are not required to have a plan, a vision, a clear sense of direction. Today, your only job is today. What does today require? It requires that you are still here at the end of it, that you have consumed enough food and water to continue functioning, that you have reached out to at least one person, called, texted, sat near, instead of remaining entirely alone. That you have moved your body in some way, even minimally. That is the entire list. Everything else is optional. You don't have to see the whole staircase. Just take the first step. Martin Luther King Jr. Winston Churchill, who led Britain through the most existential crisis in the country's modern history, suffered from severe depression that he called the Black Dog. He described his strategy during the worst periods in terms that will be recognizable to anyone in a dark place. He focused on the next hour, not the next battle, not the next election, not the future of the free world. The next hour. What could he do in the next hour to remain useful, to remain present, to remain engaged with the work that needed to be done? That is not small thinking. That is survival intelligence. The understanding that when the present is overwhelming, the only unit of time that can be reliably managed is the smallest possible one. What you should not do alone. There are things in the night before the morning that are genuinely too heavy to carry without help. I will name some of them directly, because people in crisis are often not thinking clearly enough to identify their own limits. If you are having thoughts of suicide, not just the passing thought that the world might be easier without you, but active planning, or the sense that disappearing is a solution, this is the moment to ask for help. Not tomorrow. Not when you feel more ready. Now. The mind in crisis is not a reliable narrator of its own circumstances. It cannot be trusted to accurately assess its own options. A second set of eyes, a therapist, a crisis line, a person who knows you and is not in the same darkness, is not a luxury at this juncture. It is a necessity. If you're using substances to manage the pain of what you're going through, and the amounts are increasing, or the control is decreasing, or the substance has become the primary coping mechanism, this is also too heavy to carry alone. Substance use in the context of crisis is not moral weakness. It is the nervous system finding the fastest available route to relief. But the route leads somewhere worse than where you started. This also requires help. Asking for help when you are in the night before the morning is not an admission of defeat. It is the most strategically intelligent thing you can do. The strongest people, by any definition of strong, ask for help when the situation exceeds their individual capacity. This is not weakness. This is wisdom, the light that was always coming. I want to tell you something that is true, even though it will not feel true while you're reading it. The morning comes, not as a cliche, not as a metaphor for the absence of difficulty, as a literal, documented, historically consistent reality. Human beings survive rock bottoms. They do more than survive them. They are changed by them, and the change, entered honestly, processed with help, faced without running, produces something that ease and comfort never produce. The people who have told their stories of rock bottom and recovery, the ones you'll meet throughout this book, all say versions of the same thing. Not that they are glad it happened. That would be glib. But that the person they are now, with everything they know, with the depth they carry, with the empathy they have developed for other people in darkness, that person is someone they would not trade for the person they were before the fall. You cannot see that yet. You're not supposed to see it yet. The night before the morning is not the moment for perspective. It is the moment for survival. Survive. The rest will follow. Chapter 4. The Story of Marcus. A life rebuilt from ash. A story to help you see what rebuilding actually looks like from the inside. Sometimes the best way to understand a truth is to walk through it with someone else. Not statistics, not research, not even famous examples from history, though we will have those too. Sometimes what we need is a face, a life, the specific, textured reality of one person navigating the thing we need to understand. The following is the story of Marcus. He is a composite, built from the experiences of real people, research into post-traumatic growth, and the documented patterns of genuine recovery. His story is not any one person's story, but it is true in the way that all good stories are true. It reflects something real about the human experience of falling and climbing back. Read it slowly. Don't skip to the resolution. The middle is the point. A story. The man with nothing left. Marcus had a specific way of sitting in his car before going inside anywhere. Hands on the wheel at 10 and 2. Engine off. Eyes on nothing in particular, doing the arithmetic of whatever the next hour required. He'd been doing it for years without noticing. It was only after everything fell apart that he realized what the pause was for. It was the only moment in any given day that belonged entirely to him. He was 38 years old when a company closed. Not his fault, or not entirely. A contract lost, a cash flow problem that had been manageable and then suddenly wasn't, a decision made in panic that made everything worse. 12 employees, 4 of whom had been with him since the beginning. He had called them into the conference room one Tuesday morning and watched their faces change as he explained what they already suspected. The meeting took 11 minutes. He had replayed it 10,000 times since. The divorce came 4 months later. His wife, Maya, had held things together as long as she could. She had worked double shifts at the hospital when the business started struggling, had absorbed his moods without complaint for longer than was fair. When she finally said she needed to leave, she was not cruel about it. That almost made it worse. Cruel would have given him something to be angry at. By the following spring, Marcus was renting a room above a laundromat. The room had one window, a hot plate, and a water stain on the ceiling that looked, if you squinted, like the state of Texas. He was $63,000 in debt. He hadn't spoken to his brother in 4 months. He had a job offer on the table from a competitor, a job that would have felt like humiliation 2 years ago and now felt like salvation, and he couldn't bring himself to call back and accept it. He sat in his car a lot. The thing about the bottom, Marcus would tell you later, much later, when he had enough distance to describe it without his voice going flat, was that it didn't feel like the bottom while he was in it. It felt like the condition of his life. He had been in enough pain for long enough that the pain had stopped feeling like a temporary state and it started feeling like a permanent one, like whether you eventually stop hoping will change. The shift began in the most mundane way imaginable. He ran out of coffee. He walked to the convenience store on the corner, and the woman at the register, whose name he'd never learned despite buying coffee there 3 times a week, looked up at him and said, "You look like you haven't slept in a month." Not unkindly, just observationally, the way you might note that someone has a bit of spinach in their teeth. "I haven't," he said, and something about saying it to a stranger, not pretending, not performing, just saying it plainly, cracked something loose. He went home and called his brother. His brother, who answered on the second ring, and said nothing for a long moment after Marcus said the words, "I'm not okay," and then said, "Tell me." That was the beginning. Not a dramatic moment. Not a bolt of lightning. 2 words from a man who hadn't been called in 4 months. "Tell me." Marcus told him. Everything. The whole catalog of failures and humiliations and fears he'd been carrying alone in a room above a laundromat. His brother listened without fixing. At the end, he said, "When did you eat last?" Marcus thought about it. "Yesterday morning, I think." "Okay," his brother said. "So that's step 1. Step 1. Not the debt. Not the career. Not the marriage, the employees, the $63,000, the 11-minute meeting he'd replayed 10,000 times. A meal. 1 meal. That was the whole plan for that afternoon. They met at a diner that smelled like pancakes and old coffee. Marcus ordered eggs he could barely eat. His brother talked about small things, his kids, a movie he'd seen, and Marcus understood, years later, that his brother was doing this deliberately. He was not minimizing the disaster. He was demonstrating that ordinary life still existed somewhere, and that it was possible to sit inside it for an hour without the weight being the only thing in the room. The job offer. Marcus accepted it. He made the call the next morning, before he could talk himself out of it. His voice was steady. He said yes. The woman on the other end said they were glad, and he realized that somewhere in the last 6 months he had stopped being able to imagine himself being useful to anyone. The debt took 4 years. Not 4 dramatic years of grinding triumph. 4 ordinary years of making the next payment, having the next conversation, putting one foot in front of the other through hundreds of mornings that felt like nothing and accumulated, without him noticing, into something. He built a new company eventually. Smaller. Different. He hired 5 people this time instead of 12, and he knew all of their middle names and the names of their children. When one of them came to him 2 years in, visibly struggling, clearly carrying something too heavy, Marcus closed his office door and said, "Tell me." He had learned, from the bottom of the worst year of his life, exactly what those 2 words were worth. What Marcus's story contains. Marcus's story is not a story of extraordinary talent or miraculous recovery. It is a story of ordinary moves, made in the right order, with the help of imperfect people. He told the truth to a stranger before he could tell it to someone he knew. That is not uncommon. The distance of strangers sometimes makes honesty easier. He called his brother not when he felt ready, but when he ran out of reasons to delay. His brother did not fix anything. He just showed up and ordered him to eat. The job felt like humiliation and turned out to be the thread that pulled him back into usefulness. The debt was resolved not through a single brilliant strategy, but through 4 years of the next payment. This is what rebuilding actually looks like from the inside. Not a montage. Not a turning point that resolves everything. A series of small, imperfect, often unglamorous actions that accumulate, without your noticing, into a different life. The most important thing Marcus did, the thing on which everything else depended, was he let someone in. He said the words, "I'm not okay," to his brother, and he meant them, and he let them be received. That act, the willingness to be known in the worst moment rather than protected in it, is the hinge on which recovery turns for the vast majority of people. You don't have to have a brother who answers on the second ring. You need a person, one person, and the willingness to say 2 words, "I'm struggling." Everything else can wait until you've done that. Chapter 5. Identity After Destruction. Who are you now? The collapse didn't just take your circumstances. It took your story about yourself. The question that no one tells you to expect. The one that surfaces after the immediate crisis has passed, once the logistics have been handled and the acute pain has settled into a duller, more chronic ache, is not "what do I do next?" It is "who am I now?" And it is the harder question by far. Identity, is not just a psychological concept. It is a navigational system. Your sense of who you are tells you how to behave in new situations, what choices are available to you, what kind of treatment from others is acceptable, what kind of future is worth pursuing. When rock bottom strips away the roles and achievements and relationships and financial standing that you've used to answer the question, who am I? The navigational system goes dark. This is why so many people in the aftermath of rock bottom describe feeling directionless. Not just sad, not just shaken, literally directionless, as though the internal compass that used to point reliably north is now spinning without settling. The architecture of identity. Psychologist Erik Erikson described identity as the answer to the question, who am I and where am I going? But identity is not a single answer. It is a layered system of answers built over a lifetime that collectively tell us how to orient ourselves in the world. The outermost layer is role identity: parent, spouse, professional, entrepreneur, athlete. These are the labels we wear in social contexts. They are the first things stripped away by rock bottom, and their loss is genuinely painful, but is not the deepest loss. The middle layer is achievement identity, the accomplishments, the credentials, the track record that we use to justify our own worth and signal our value to others. When the business fails, when the career ends, when the relationship history contains what we experience as an irrevocable failure, this layer is shaken. This is where shame lives. The deepest layer is core identity, the values, the character, the ways of being in the world that persist regardless of circumstances. And here is the crucial insight that most people in the aftermath of rock bottom do not yet have access to. Rock bottom, no matter how catastrophic, cannot touch the deepest layer unless you let it. The business can fail. The marriage can end. The career can collapse. Your character, your curiosity, your capacity for love, your integrity, your fundamental ways of showing up for other people is still there, underneath everything, waiting. You are not your resume. You are not your bank account. You are not the worst thing that has ever happened to you. The danger of overcorrecting. There is a particular trap that people in identity crisis fall into, and it is one of the most well-documented in the psychology of resilience. The attempt to rebuild an identical version of a lost identity as quickly as possible. The entrepreneur who loses their company and immediately starts another one from the same operating system that produced the first failure. The person who leaves one relationship and immediately enters another that replicates the same dynamic. The professional who loses a position and frantically replicates it in a different organization, bringing with them all the same patterns that made the old one unsustainable. The impulse is understandable. The lost identity was familiar. It was functional. It had worked, at least for a while. And the state of not having an identity, the directionless, untethered state of being between stories, is profoundly uncomfortable. We will do almost anything to escape it. But here's what the fastest rebuilders miss. The time in the gap, the time between the old identity and the new one, is not wasted time. It is, in many ways, the most important time. It is the time in which you have the rare opportunity to choose your identity deliberately, rather than inheriting it from your circumstances or your past. Most people never get this opportunity. They inhabit identities assembled in their 20s, shaped by accident and expectation and the path of least resistance, and carry those identities for the rest of their lives without ever examining whether the identity fits the person they actually are, the life they actually want. Rock bottom, as brutal as it is, gives you the chance to be intentional. To ask, given everything I now know about myself, about what I can survive, about what actually matters, who do I want to be? Starting the inventory. The identity inventory is not a quick exercise. It cannot be completed in an afternoon, but it can be begun today with 3 simple questions that you return to regularly, that you sit with rather than rush through. The first question: what values did I hold before the fall that I still hold now? Not the behaviors, the values underneath the behaviors. The belief in fairness, the care for other people, the curiosity about ideas, the commitment to honesty, even when it was inconvenient. These do not go away when circumstances change. Identifying them is the process of finding the bedrock beneath the rubble. The second question: What did the collapse teach me about who I am? Not what it taught you about what you did wrong. That accounting is separate, but what it revealed about your character. The people who showed up, the reserves of endurance you discovered you had, the clarity about what you will and will not do, even under extreme pressure. The third question, what kind of person do I want to be in the life that comes after this? This is not a vision board question. This is a character question. Not what kind of career, not what kind of house, not what kind of relationship. What kind of person? What qualities do you want to define your next chapter? These questions, answered honestly and revisited often, are the foundation of a rebuilt identity. They take time. They require quiet. They sometimes produce answers that are uncomfortable, that reveal gaps between who you were and who you want to be that the next life will need close. But they also produce something that a resumed, old identity cannot produce, a self that was chosen, a self that fits, a self that is yours, built from the inside out, rather than assembled from whatever was available. Chapter 6. The Lies You Believe. When you are broken, your mind at rock bottom is not a neutral observer. It is a prosecutor, and it is lying to you. The mind in crisis is not objective. We like to think that our interior voice, the running commentary of our own thoughts, is at least trying to tell us the truth. In normal conditions, this is roughly accurate, with the usual biases and distortions that affect all human cognition. In crisis, it is categorically false. The mind under extreme stress does not assess the situation accurately. It catastrophizes. It overgeneralizes. It confabulates. And it tells you, with complete conviction, that its catastrophizing is simply realism. Cognitive psychologists call the distorted thinking patterns that emerge under stress cognitive distortions, and they are not occasional glitches. They are systematic errors in reasoning that become dominant modes of thought when the psychological system is overloaded. If you have ever found yourself at rock bottom, you have experienced them. You may not have known what they were, but you have heard them. They sound like this. The 5 lies rock bottom tells. Lie 1. This is permanent. The most foundational distortion, and the most dangerous. The mind in crisis extrapolates from the present moment to forever. I am failing becomes, I will always fail. I am alone becomes, I will always be alone. I am in pain becomes the pain will never end. This is not reasoning. This is a feature of a brain that is operating under threat. It has narrowed its focus to the immediate problem so completely that it has lost access to the broader temporal perspective that would allow it to accurately assess the probability that things will change. And things do change. This is one of the most robustly documented findings in the psychology of human experience. Our ability to predict our own future emotional states is consistently and significantly inaccurate. We overestimate how long negative states will last. We underestimate our own resilience. We literally cannot, from inside the crisis, accurately predict what we will feel in a year. This is called effective forecasting bias, and it operates against us every time we conclude from rock bottom that this is simply how it is now, forever. Lie 2. This defines me. The collapse becomes, in the distorted thinking of crisis, a total description of the self. Not I experienced a failure, but I am a failure. Not my marriage ended, but I am someone whose marriage ends. This overgeneralization, taking a specific event and using it to rewrite the entire story of the self, is both psychologically predictable and factually baseless. Walt Disney was fired from his first newspaper job for lacking imagination and having no original ideas. Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team. Oprah Winfrey was told by a Baltimore news producer that she was unfit for television. If these events had defined these people, if the external verdict of a single moment in a single circumstance had been accepted as a complete accounting of their worth and potential, the world would be measurably, concretely poorer. The verdict of your worst moment is not the verdict of your life. Lie 3. I deserve this. Shame is the engine of this particular distortion. When something catastrophic happens, especially when our own choices played a role in its happening, the mind leaps to punishment, to the conclusion that the suffering is just, that this is what was coming, that on some level, you had it coming. There are choices worth being accountable for. There is a legitimate reckoning with how your behavior contributed to where you are. But accountability and punishment are not the same thing. Accountability says I contributed to this, and I need to understand how so I can do differently. Punishment says I am bad, and this is what I deserve. Accountability is useful. It produces change. Punishment is not useful. It produces shame spirals that make change harder, not easier. Lie 4. No one else understands. The isolation that rock bottom produces is partly circumstantial and partly cognitive, a distortion that insists your situation is uniquely shameful, uniquely catastrophic, uniquely disqualifying from the sympathy and understanding of other people. This lie keeps people silent. It keeps them from reaching out. It ensures that the very connection that would most help them remains out of reach. The antidote to this lie is exposure. Not dramatic disclosure, necessarily, but any evidence, a conversation, a book, a story heard from someone who went through something similar, that other human beings have stood in your particular darkness and found their way out. This is one of the reasons support groups work, even for people who are skeptical of support groups. The simple, irreplaceable experience of hearing someone else say, "I went through something like this, and I am still here," does something that no amount of private reasoning can replicate. Lie 5. Asking for help will make it worse. This lie is a distillation of shame, pride, and fear. It imagines that reaching out will confirm others' worst suspicions about you, will burden the people you love, will make you look weaker than you already feel. It is almost never true. In the vast majority of cases, reaching out produces the opposite of what the lie predicts: connection, relief, practical support, and the profound psychological shift that comes from being known in your worst moment and still held. The bravest thing I ever did was continuing my life when I wanted to die. Juliette Lewis. Countering the lies. The reality test. The most effective psychological tool for addressing cognitive distortions is deceptively simple. You ask the distorted thought to provide evidence for its claims, not to dismiss it. The thought, however distorted, is usually pointing at something real, but to interrogate it, to require it to meet the same evidentiary standard you would apply to any other claim about reality. Is it true that this is permanent? What evidence supports the claim that this will never change? What evidence contradicts it? Who do I know who has been in something comparable and is in a different place now? What does the historical record of human recovery from comparable circumstances actually show? The answers, when gathered honestly, are almost universally inconsistent with the distortion. Not painlessly inconsistent. The truth that things will change does not immediately make the present easier, but accurately inconsistent. And accuracy, over time, is a form of mercy. You are being lied to by the loudest voice in the room. You don't have to believe everything you think. Chapter 7. Shame, Silence, and the Weight. You were never meant to carry alone. The thing that keeps you isolated is the same thing that isolation makes worse. Shame is the most social emotion in the human repertoire. It is, by definition, about how we believe we appear to others. It is the experience of seeing yourself through imagined eyes that find you wanting, defective, lesser, unworthy. And it thrives, absolutely thrives, in isolation. Because in isolation, those imagined eyes are the only ones looking. There is no other evidence available. Brené Brown, whose decade of research on shame has produced some of the most important insights in modern psychology, has said that shame needs 3 things to survive: secrecy, silence, and judgment. And that it cannot survive one thing: being met with empathy. Empathy does not just reduce shame. It dissolves it. Not permanently, necessarily, but in the moment of contact, in the space of being truly heard by someone who is not horrified by what they hear, shame loses its grip. This is why the single most consistently effective intervention in cases of severe shame is not therapy, not journaling, not positive self-talk, not any individual practice. It is connection. The specific, irreplaceable experience of telling your story to another person who responds with recognition rather than rejection. Why we stay silent. Understanding why shame produces silence is not complicated. If you believe, as shame insists you should believe, that what you are carrying reveals something fundamentally wrong with you, then exposure of what you are carrying is exposure of what is wrong with you. And so you don't. You perform wellness. You construct the social surface that other people see. You answer fine to, "How are you?" when fine is the furthest thing from the truth. This performance has costs that are specific and cumulative. It requires enormous energy that is already depleted by the crisis itself. It increases isolation by making genuine connection impossible. You cannot be truly known by people who are only seeing the performance. And it locks you inside the narrative that shame has constructed, because there is no one to offer a different narrative. No one to say, "What you're describing sounds human to me, not monstrous." No one to say, "I went through something like this too." There is also a neurological dimension to the cost of silence. Research by Dr. James Pennybaker at the University of Texas found that suppressing disclosure of difficult experiences, actively working to keep them secret, places measurable stress on the nervous system. The act of inhibition is physiologically taxing. People who are carrying undisclosed trauma have elevated stress hormone levels, suppressed immune function, and more frequent physical illness than comparable people who have disclosed their experiences. Keeping secrets that matter is expensive. The body pays the bill. The 3 levels of disclosure. Telling your story does not require a single, dramatic, tell-all confession to the largest possible audience. Disclosure is not binary. It has levels, and the appropriate level depends on the relationship, the context, and where you're in the process. Level 1 is the private disclosure. Writing. Journaling, specifically. Pennybaker's research is unequivocal on this. Writing in detail about a difficult experience, the facts, the emotions, the meanings you are making of it, produces measurable improvements in physical health, psychological well-being, and cognitive function. Not because writing is therapy, it isn't, but because the act of putting language to experience organizes it. It moves the experience from the wordless, unprocessed region of emotional memory into the more manageable territory of narrative. Once something has a story shape, it is more navigable. Level 2 is the intimate disclosure. One trusted person, not necessarily a therapist, though a therapist is never the wrong choice. A friend, a sibling, a mentor, someone with whom you have enough history and trust that vulnerability feels possible, even if terrifying. The goal of this disclosure is not to be fixed. It is to be known. To have someone receive what you have been carrying and not be destroyed by the weight of it, which disproves the shame narrative that it is too much to share. Level 3 is the community disclosure. Groups, communities, or public contexts in which your experience becomes something that connects you to others rather than isolates you. This is the level at which support groups operate, at which people share their recovery stories, at which the experience of rock bottom becomes not a source of shame, but a qualification, proof that you have been in the fire and know what it is like. You don't heal alone. You heal in relationship. Always. The weight that was never yours alone. There is something that the silence of shame prevents you from knowing, and it is this: you are not the only one. Whatever you are carrying, whatever the specific content of your rock bottom, however particular and humiliating and unique it feels, there are people in your city, in your country, in every country on earth who have carried something recognizably similar, who have felt the same specific weight of the same specific shame. You are not an aberration. You are not uniquely damaged. You are a member, albeit an involuntary one, of the largest possible club, the human beings who have known failure, loss, collapse, and the particular darkness of not knowing how to go on. That club has produced some of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived. They found each other. They told the truth. They were held by someone who did not flinch. And they got up. Tell someone. Not everyone. Someone. The weight was never meant to be carried alone. Chapter 8. Rebuilding from the foundation up. The architecture of a new life. You don't rebuild a life in one move. You lay one stone at a time. And that is enough. When the collapsed building has been cleared, the temptation is to begin construction immediately. To fill the empty lot as quickly as possible. To have something standing again, even if what you build is rushed and the foundation is not as solid as it should be. This temptation is understandable. The empty lot is uncomfortable. The absence of structure, of a recognizable life, of a story you can tell yourself about where things are going. This absence is its own form of suffering. We are meaning-making creatures, and a life without a legible narrative is disorienting in the most fundamental way. But the most important variable in determining the strength of a rebuilt life is not the speed of reconstruction. It is the quality of the foundation. And the foundation, the absolute bedrock on which everything else will rest, consists of 5 elements that must be laid before anything else can reliably stand. The 5 foundation stones. Foundation stone 1. Physical stability. The body is the house everything else lives in. Before you can rebuild your finances, your relationships, your career, your identity, the body needs to be functional. Not perfect, not optimized. Functional. Sleep that is as regular and protected as possible. Food that sustains rather than medicates. Some form of movement, however modest. These are not luxuries. They are the literal physiological substrate on which cognitive function, emotional regulation, and decision-making capacity depend. Rebuild the body first, even if the body is not what collapsed. Foundation stone 2. Safety. Physical safety, financial safety, even minimal, a roof, food, the basics, and psychological safety. This last one is often overlooked. Psychological safety means having at least one context in which you do not have to perform, in which you can be honest about where you actually are. A therapist's office, a trusted friend's home, a support group room. The nervous system cannot rebuild from a state of constant threat. Some element of safety must be established before the deeper work is possible. Foundation stone 3. One anchor relationship. Not a network, not a community, one person. A human being who knows the truth of your situation and is still there. Who checks in not because they feel obligated, but because they genuinely give a damn. This relationship is not the entire social structure you will eventually rebuild. It is the load-bearing pillar. The single structural element that, if it holds, makes everything else possible to reach. Foundation stone 4. One meaningful action per day. Not a full life of purpose and meaning. One action, daily, that connects you to something larger than your own crisis. Volunteering, helping a neighbor, writing something, creating something, teaching something. The psychological research on meaning and recovery is clear. People who engage in even minimal pro-social behavior that is oriented toward others rather than exclusively toward their own survival, recover faster and more completely than those who don't. Meaning is not a luxury. It is a structural requirement for human psychological health. Foundation stone 5. A horizon, however small. Not a complete vision of the rebuilt life. A 1-year horizon. A 1-month horizon. Even a 1-week horizon. Just enough to give the forward-planning parts of the brain something to work with. The person who has a specific, achievable goal for the next 30 days is in a fundamentally different psychological position than the person who is simply surviving. Both are valid, but the first has somewhere to face. Don't look for the next 50 moves. Just make the first right one. The myth of a clean slate. One of the most seductive ideas about rebuilding is the idea of the clean slate. The notion that rock bottom clears everything away and leaves you free to build from scratch, unencumbered by your history. This is partly true. Rock bottom does clear some things away. It removes structures that were not serving you. It strips away pretenses. It sometimes eliminates relationships, circumstances, and commitments that were part of what was not working. In that sense, yes, there's clearing. But you're not a clean slate. You are a person with a history, with scars, with patterns of thought and behavior that were formed long before the collapse and did not disappear in it. Those patterns will show up in the rebuilt life unless they are examined. The relationship patterns that contributed to what happened. The financial behaviors. The communication habits. The ways of managing stress and emotion that, under ordinary pressure, worked well enough, and under extraordinary pressure, did not. The rebuilt life is not a life lived by a different person. It is a life lived by you, wiser, more honest with yourself, more clear about what you value and what you can and cannot sustain. But you. The work of rebuilding is not reinvention. It is renovation, keeping what was good, replacing what was not, reinforcing the structure where it was weak, and building with the full knowledge of what collapsed and why. Patience as a structural principle. Viktor Frankl observed, from the particular vantage point of having survived the unsurvivable, that human beings can endure almost anything if they can see a why. The suffering becomes bearable not because it is less severe, but because it is meaningful, because it is in service of something. The person rebuilding after rock bottom needs to develop patience not as a personality trait, but as a structural principle. The understanding that what is being built takes the time it takes, and that the urgency to have it done faster is itself a form of the old pattern that led here. The cathedrals of Europe took centuries. They were built by people who never saw them finished, who laid stones in the complete faith that the stones mattered, that the structure would eventually stand, that the work done today would support the arch placed in 100 years. That is a kind of patience that modern sensibility finds almost incomprehensible. But it is, in its essence, what rebuilding a life requires. The willingness to lay the next stone without demanding to see the finished building, trusting that the right stones, laid in the right order, will eventually produce something worth living in. Chapter 9. Pain as Curriculum. What your worst experience is teaching you. The lesson was always in the fire. You just couldn't read it while you were burning. This is the chapter that most books about resilience rush to. It is the one that comes too early in most narratives. The turn from suffering to meaning, from damage to lesson, from rock bottom to wisdom. And it comes too early because the lesson is real, but it is not accessible from inside the acute crisis. You cannot read the curriculum while the test is still happening. But there comes a point, not a precise moment, more of a gradual shift in altitude, when the acute phase has passed enough that you can begin to look at what you went through not just as something that happened to you, but as something that happened for you to learn from. This is not a positive thinking exercise. It is a practice of extraction, of deliberately pulling meaning from an experience that contained it, whether you wanted it to or not. Post-traumatic growth. The research is real. The concept of post-traumatic stress is widely known. The concept of post-traumatic growth is less so, though the research is equally robust. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who coined the term in the 1990s, spent decades studying people who had experienced serious trauma and found something that, at first, seems counterintuitive. A significant proportion of trauma survivors, in some studies, the majority, reported not just recovery, but genuine improvement in specific dimensions of their lives in the aftermath of their worst experiences. The growth appeared in 5 consistent areas: personal strength, a clearer sense of what they could endure and survive; new possibilities, openness to paths and directions they would not have considered before the trauma; relating to others, deeper empathy and appreciation for connection; appreciation for life, a qualitative shift in how they experienced ordinary moments; and spiritual or existential change, a deepened engagement with questions of meaning and purpose. This growth did not come from the trauma itself. It came from a struggle with the trauma. The people who grew were not the ones who experienced the least pain. They were the ones who engaged with the pain most honestly, who sat with it, processed it, made meaning from it rather than suppressing it or performing their way through it. The wound is the place where the light enters you. Rumi. Extracting the lessons, a framework. Extracting meaning from what you went through is not a passive process. It requires deliberate reflection, the willingness to turn toward the experience, examine it, and ask specific questions that the experience is capable of answering. Question 1. What did this experience reveal about what I actually value? Not what I said I valued. Not what I thought I valued before the test. What proved to matter when everything was stripped away? When the house is on fire, you discover what you grab. What did you grab? Those are your actual values. Question 2. What did I discover about my own capacity? Most people who have been through rock bottom discover that they had access to reserves of endurance, creativity, and resilience that they did not know existed. The discovery of that capacity, not as a belief, but as a lived, tested fact, changes the relationship to future difficulty. The person who has survived the unsurvivable approaches the next hard thing differently. Not without fear, but without the same terror of their own inadequacy. Question 3. What can I now offer that I couldn't before? The specific empathy that comes from having been in the fire is not reproducible by any other means. The person who has experienced bankruptcy speaks to financial devastation from a place of authority that no financial education can replicate. The person who has been through addiction speaks to the people still in it from a place of recognition that no clinical training produces. The person who has survived the darkest depression speaks to those in it with a kind of presence that no amount of sympathy can match. Your experience, specifically because it was hard, specifically because it cost you something, is a form of currency that can now be offered to other people in ways that are uniquely valuable. Question 4. What story am I telling about this? And is it the right story? The same events can be narrated as a tragedy, a cautionary tale, or an origin story. All three narratives may contain elements of truth, but only one of them, the origin story, positions you as the protagonist of your own life rather than the victim of its plot. Choosing the origin story is not denial of what happened. It is a recognition that how we narrate our experience shapes what we are able to do with it. You are not defined by what happened. You are shaped by what you did with it. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz. He lost his wife, his parents, his brother, the manuscript of a book he had worked on for years. He was subjected to conditions of deliberate dehumanization designed to strip away every vestige of meaning and dignity. He emerged with his life, barely, and with a philosophy that has helped millions of people who never came anywhere near his level of suffering. His central insight, born from the most extreme possible context, was this: everything can be taken from a person except the freedom to choose one's attitude toward the circumstances given. That freedom, the freedom to decide what one's suffering means, what one does in response to it, who one chooses to be in the face of it, is the last remaining human freedom when all others have been removed. Your circumstances are real. Your pain is real. The cost of what happened is real. But the meaning you make of it, the story you choose to tell, the lesson you choose to extract, the person you choose to become in the aftermath, that is yours. That has always been yours. Choose it deliberately. Chapter 10. The people who help you rise, and the ones who don't. Not everyone in your life is equipped to support your recovery. Knowing the difference is essential. One of the less discussed realities of rebuilding after rock bottom is this: some of the people you expected to help you won't. And some of the people you never expected to show up will be the ones who save you. Both of these things are true, and both of them matter. And the sooner you understand them, the more strategically and honestly you can navigate the relationships in your rebuilding. People respond to others' rock bottoms in ways that reveal their own character, their own fears, their own relationship to failure and vulnerability. Some people, including some who love you genuinely, will be unable to be present with your collapse. Not because they don't care, because your collapse activates something in them they haven't resolved. The successful friend who can't bear to see you fail because it threatens their own belief that following the rules keeps you safe. The family member who becomes critical or distant because vulnerability triggers their own defenses. The colleague who disappears because association with failure feels risky. These are not villains. They are people with their own limitations. But knowing their limitations is important so that you don't spend your most depleted reserves trying to receive from people who don't currently have it to give. The anatomy of a rebuilding relationship. The relationships that most support recovery share a specific set of characteristics, identified consistently in the research on social support and resilience. Understanding what these characteristics are helps you identify who you have, who you need, and what you are offering when you're the one supporting someone else. First, they are honest without being cruel. The most valuable people in a rebuilding context are not the ones who tell you what you want to hear. They are the ones who tell you the truth about where you are, about what they observe, about what they think you might be missing, in a way that is grounded in genuine care rather than judgment. This combination is rare. People tend to either avoid difficult truths to protect the relationship or deliver them without sufficient warmth to make them receivable. The people who can do both, honest and kind simultaneously, are irreplaceable. Second, they don't require a performance. The most exhausting aspect of maintaining difficult social relationships during crisis is the energy required to manage other people's emotional responses to your situation. The friend who is so distressed by your distress that you spend the conversation managing their feelings rather than expressing yours. The family member whose anxiety about your situation requires constant reassurance. The relationships that most support recovery are the ones where you can simply be where you are without having to manage the room. Third, they show up over time, not just in the acute phase. Crisis has a way of producing an initial surge of support that is genuine, but often temporary. The casseroles arrive in the first week. The check-ins happen in the first month. And then life goes on for the people who are not in the crisis, and the support tapers as the acute phase fades, even as the person in recovery is often entering the hardest psychological territory, which tends to arrive after the initial shock has passed. The people who show up 6 months in, when the drama has subsided and the real work is happening, are the most valuable of all. Surround yourself only with people who are going to take you higher. Oprah Winfrey. The people you outgrow. Here is something that recovery literature rarely discusses, because it is complicated and sometimes painful. The process of rebuilding after rock bottom sometimes reveals that certain relationships in your life were built on a version of you that no longer exists. Relationships built on shared patterns of avoidance. The friends you drank with, the people whose primary function was to validate the behaviors that contributed to your collapse. These relationships may not survive your recovery. Not because those people are bad, but because recovery requires changes in behavior and environment that are simply incompatible with those relationships as they previously existed. Relationships built on a power dynamic that your rock bottom has altered. The mentor who needs you to remain in need of mentoring. The friend whose sense of self depends on being more successful than you are. The family member whose role is defined by rescuing you rather than witnessing you. These two may shift in ways that are uncomfortable for everyone. This is not a crisis. It is a calibration. A life rebuilt on honest foundations sometimes requires the painful acknowledgement that certain relationships were built on foundations that are no longer there. The grief of that is real, and the space it creates is also real. Space for relationships that fit who you are becoming rather than who you were. How to ask for what you need. Most people in crisis have difficulty asking for what they need because they have not articulated it, even to themselves. They know they need something. They do not know how to name it specifically enough to request it from another person. The practice of specific asking, not "I need support," but "I need someone to sit with me this afternoon," or "I need you to listen without offering solutions for the next 20 minutes," or "I need help thinking through this one practical problem," is a learnable skill. It feels vulnerable in a way that feels disproportionate to the ask, but it produces something that vague expressions of need cannot: the possibility of being specifically, usefully met. People, generally, want to help. They are often uncertain how. Telling them specifically how removes the barrier between their willingness and your need. That specificity is not a burden. It is a gift. Chapter 11. Forgiving the fall. The hardest chapter. You cannot carry the weight of what happened and still climb. One of them has to go. Forgiveness is the most misunderstood concept in the territory of recovery. It is misunderstood in ways that make it seem either impossibly saintly, requiring the suspension of all legitimate anger and grief, the pretense that what happened was acceptable, or strategically pointless, as though the only beneficiary of forgiveness is the person being forgiven. Both misunderstandings are wrong, and they matter because forgiveness of others, and perhaps more critically, of yourself, is not a moral luxury. It is a practical necessity for anyone who intends to actually rebuild rather than simply survive. What forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. You can forgive someone without welcoming them back into your life. You can forgive a person whose behavior was genuinely harmful without pretending it was not, without excusing it, without exposing yourself to a repeat performance. Forgiveness is an internal act. Reconciliation is a relational act. They are not the same thing, and conflating them makes forgiveness seem like something it is not, an endorsement of what happened. Forgiveness is not forgetting. The memory of what happened, the specific events, the pain, the cost, does not have to be erased for forgiveness to be real. In fact, forgiveness that depends on forgetting is fragile, because it collapses the moment the memory resurfaces. Real forgiveness holds the memory clearly and chooses, deliberately and repeatedly, not to be defined and consumed by it. Forgiveness is not approval. It is not the statement that what happened was okay. It is the statement that you are no longer willing to organize your interior life around what happened. That the event, the person, the circumstance no longer has the power to dictate your emotional state, your sense of yourself, your relationship to the present. The cost of unforgiveness. Carrying unforgiveness, the sustained, active state of resentment, blame, and bitterness toward what happened or who caused it, is one of the most physiologically expensive states a human being can inhabit. The research on this is extensive and consistent. Chronic resentment and unforgiveness are associated with elevated cortisol, elevated blood pressure, compromised immune function, higher rates of depression and anxiety, and shorter lifespan. This is not poetic. It is biological. The body keeps score of what the mind carries. And the sustained holding of a grievance, however legitimate, is stored as chronic stress, which produces all the downstream consequences of chronic stress. Lewis Smedes, the theologian who wrote perhaps the most honest book about forgiveness ever produced, said this: "To forgive is to set a prisoner free and then discover that the prisoner was you. The person who wronged you, who contributed to your rock bottom, who betrayed you, who let you down, is living their life. They may not be thinking about it. They may not be suffering for it. Your unforgiveness does not punish them. It punishes you. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." Buddha. The even harder forgiveness, forgiving yourself. If forgiving others is the road most people know they need to walk, forgiving yourself is the one most people pretend doesn't exist. Or they know it exists, and they don't believe they deserve to walk it yet. Maybe someday, when they have proven something, when they have made sufficient amends, when they have suffered enough to have earned the right to let it go. This is the cruelest misunderstanding of all. Self-forgiveness is not a reward for sufficient suffering. It is not a prize at the end of a penance course. It is a decision made not because the behavior you are forgiving yourself for was acceptable. It may well have not been, but because carrying the full weight of it indefinitely serves no one. Not the people it affected, not your own recovery, not the future you're trying to build. There is a difference between taking responsibility and self-punishment that is permanent. Taking responsibility says, "I understand what I did. I understand the impact. I have made what amends I can. I will do differently going forward." Self-punishment says, "I will never be allowed to be okay again." One of these is honest. The other is a story, and it is a story that serves no one. The person you are forgiving, the version of yourself who made the choices that led to the collapse, was doing what they knew how to do with what they had. They were operating with incomplete information, under pressure that may have exceeded their capacity, with the tools their history had given them. They were human. They failed in the way that human beings fail, not through malice or stupidity, but through the complex, unpredictable interplay of circumstance, character, and accumulated pressure. You would extend more compassion than this to a stranger with the same story. Extend some of it to yourself. The practice of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a practice, something returned to again and again as the feelings return. The moment of sincere forgiveness, whether of another or of yourself, does not inoculate you permanently against the return of resentment or self-recrimination. Those feelings will come back. The practice is in the choosing again, when they do, to return to forgiveness rather than to reoccupy the prison of unforgiveness. What the practice looks like, practically, writing the story of what happened from a position of compassionate observer, neither defending nor condemning, but understanding, articulating specifically what you are forgiving and why, identifying what you are choosing to do with the energy that unforgiveness was consuming, and then noticing when the resentment resurfaces that you have already made the decision and making it again. It is not quick. It is not once, but it is possible, and it is the prerequisite for everything that comes after. Chapter 12. Becoming unbreakable. Building a life that can take the weight. The goal is not to avoid the next storm. It is to be someone the storm cannot destroy. Unbreakable does not mean invulnerable. It does not mean that you will never be hurt again, that nothing will knock you down, that the hard things will stop happening. They will not stop happening. Life is not that arrangement. Hardship is not a problem to be solved and then filed away. It is a recurring condition of a life lived with any degree of ambition, connection, and presence. Unbreakable means something more specific and more achievable. It means having built a self and a life that can absorb difficulty without being destroyed by it. A self whose foundation is deep enough that the surface can crack without the structure collapsing. A life with enough support, enough honesty, enough meaning, that when the weight increases, it is met by something equal to the task. This chapter is about what that building actually requires. not as a guarantee against future rock bottoms. No honest book will make that guarantee, but as a structure that makes them less likely, less devastating, and recoverable from faster when they do occur. The pillars of an unbreakable life. The first pillar is radical self-honesty. Most rock bottoms, examined honestly, contain warning signs that were present long before the visible collapse. The accumulating debt that was not addressed. The relationship problems that were worked around rather than through. The mental health that was managed rather than treated. The patterns of avoidance that were so familiar they stopped looking like avoidance. An unbreakable life requires the practice, not comfortable, never entirely comfortable, of looking at the actual state of things. The real financial picture. The real state of the primary relationships. The real condition of the physical and psychological health. This is not catastrophizing. It is maintenance. A structural inspection conducted regularly, with genuine honesty, before the cracks become failures. The second pillar is a community of accountability. Not a group of people who tell you what you want to hear. A group of people, even a small group, even 2 or 3, who know enough of the truth of your life to notice when something is wrong, who are permitted to say so, who you are honest enough with that their observations can reach you. This is the structural function that isolated people lack, and that the most resilient people consistently have. External checks on the self-deception that all human beings are capable of under pressure. The business partner who is permitted to say, "I think we're in trouble," before it becomes a crisis. The spouse or friend who is permitted to say, "You haven't been yourself for 6 months." These relationships don't prevent all disasters, but they catch many of them early, when early catching is still possible. The third pillar is a life built on values, not outcomes. The person whose sense of self depends entirely on outcomes, on the business succeeding, the relationship lasting, the career continuing, the health holding, is always one bad outcome away from a crisis of identity. Because outcomes are not fully within our control. They never have been. The person whose sense of self is built on values, on the consistent expression of who they are and what they stand for, regardless of what results those expressions produce, has a foundation that circumstances cannot remove. When the business fails, they are still someone who operated with integrity. When the relationship ends, they are still someone who loved fully and honestly. When the career stalls, they are still someone who cares about doing excellent work. The values survive what the outcomes do not. Build on those. I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. Maya Angelou. The fourth pillar is a practice of regular recovery. Not recovery from crisis. Recovery is a daily, weekly discipline. The intentional restoration of the resources that life depletes. Sleep, solitude, genuine connection, physical health, creative expression, spiritual practice, in whatever form is authentic. People who treat recovery as an emergency measure, something they do after the breakdown, are always catching up. People who treat recovery as a maintenance practice are rarely fully depleted. The fifth pillar is the willingness to be a beginner. The people most vulnerable to catastrophic collapse are often the people who have been most successful, because success can create a rigidity, a confidence in existing approaches, that makes it difficult to adapt when circumstances change. The unbreakable life maintains a quality of openness and willingness to learn that the arrival of competence and achievement can erode. It remains curious. It admits error. It is capable of revision. It does not confuse the map for the territory. Using the scar. There is a Japanese proverb, Nana Karobi Yooki. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. The standing up is not a return to the pre-fall state. The person who stands up 8 times carries the evidence of 7 falls. The scars, the knowledge, the specific, hard-won understanding of what it takes to get up when you are down. That knowledge is not a liability. It is a form of capital that only the fallen can possess. The person who has been through rock bottom and rebuilt is not weaker for having fallen. They are stronger at exactly the points where they were once weakest. The bone that breaks and heals properly is denser at the fracture site than it was before. The person who has collapsed and come back is more honest, more empathetic, more capable of genuine resilience than they were before the fall, because they have tested their capacity in conditions that cannot be replicated in safety. Use the scar, not as a badge of suffering, suffering is not an achievement, but is evidence. Evidence that you have been tested and have survived the test. Evidence that the worst imaginable thing happened and did not finish you. Evidence that you are, in the most literal and unmetaphorical sense, capable of rebuilding from nothing. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Chapter 13. The Daily Practice of Becoming. Recovery is not a destination you arrive at. It is a direction you keep choosing. Most books about rebuilding end at the vision. They describe what the rebuilt life looks like, the renewed sense of purpose, the rebuilt relationships, the hard-won clarity about values and direction. And then they close, as though the vision is the achievement, as though describing the destination is the same as arriving at it. It is not. The work of becoming the person your vision describes is not done in a chapter. It is done in days. Ordinary, unremarkable, often unglamorous days in which the choice to continue, to get up and show up and try again, is made not once dramatically, but in 100 small moments before lunch. This chapter is about those days, about what the daily practice of rebuilding actually looks like, not as a highlight reel, but as a lived reality. Morning, the battle for the first hour. The first hour of the day is disproportionately powerful, not because of magic or mysticism, but because of neuroscience. When you wake, your brain is in a transitional state, moving from the relative restoration of sleep into the engaged processing of waking life. In that transitional state, before the inbox is checked and the news is absorbed and the day's first problem has arrived to claim your attention, the brain is unusually receptive to intention setting. What you put into the first hour shapes the cognitive and emotional tone of everything that follows. This is not speculation. Studies on morning routines and their effect on subsequent decision-making, emotional regulation, and productivity are consistent. The people who use the first hour deliberately, not heroically, not through extreme discipline, but simply with some degree of intentionality, perform better across every metric for the remainder of the day. For the person rebuilding after rock bottom, the first hour has an additional significance. It is the time when the mind, freshly emerged from sleep, is often at its most vulnerable. The thoughts that arrive in those first waking minutes are not filtered through the social performance machinery. They are raw. They can be the most honest thoughts of the day, or the most damaging, if what surfaces is the unmediated voice of shame and self-recrimination. Claiming the first hour is not about implementing a rigid routine. It is about inserting one deliberate act, one movement, one breath, one moment of intention, before the day's reactive mode takes over. Something that says, "Today, I am the first author of this day," before anything else writes in it. Each morning we are born again. What we do today is what matters most. Buddha. Some people make this one deliberate act a few minutes of sitting quietly with a cup of something warm before looking at any screen. Others make it a walk around the block. The physical movement of choosing to engage with the world before the world chooses to engage with them. Others make it a few lines written in a notebook, not for anyone else to read, not processed or polished, just whatever is actually true about how they're feeling at the start of this particular day. The form is less important than the function. The establishment of a moment, however small, that belongs to you and to your recovery before anything else claims it. That moment, accumulated across days and weeks, becomes an anchor, a daily reminder that you have chosen this direction, that the choice stands, and that today is another opportunity to act from it. Midday, the recovery check-in. The middle of the day is where most rebuilding plans silently fall apart. Morning intentions are genuine. Evening reflections are useful. But the middle of the day, with its accumulated frictions, its unexpected demands, its small defeats and large frustrations, is where the gap between intention and behavior typically opens widest. The midday check-in is a practice of 30 seconds, not 5 minutes, not a journaling session. 30 seconds in which you pause whatever you are doing and ask 2 questions. Where am I right now? And is how I am operating consistent with who I am trying to become? The first question is about state, not evaluation, just honest description. Depleted? Anxious? More functional than I expected? The honest assessment of current state is information that improves every subsequent decision. The person who does not know they are running on empty keeps pushing in ways that produce worse outcomes and longer recovery times. The person who knows they are depleted can make better decisions about what the next hour requires. The second question is about direction. It is not about perfection, whether you have been perfect so far today. It is about direction, whether the choices you have made are generally pointing the same way as the life you're trying to build. This is a much more forgiving standard than perfection, and a much more useful one. Perfect days are rare. Days in which the overall direction is right, despite imperfections, are achievable. Evening, the honest accounting. The end of each day is an opportunity that most people either miss or misuse. They miss it by moving from the activity of the day directly into the activity of the evening. Screens, social obligations, the comfortable anesthesia of entertainment, without any transitional pause. Or they misuse it by turning what should be honest reflection into a tribunal. The prosecution of the self for everything that went wrong today, the accumulation of evidence for the shame narrative, the confirmation of the belief that nothing is changing. An honest evening accounting is neither of these. It is a brief, fair examination of the day that looks for both the evidence of growth and the evidence of the old patterns. Not to celebrate or condemn, to observe. Because observation, done consistently over time, produces something that neither self-praise nor self-punishment can produce: accurate data about what is actually changing and what is not. The questions that make an honest evening accounting useful. What did I do today that I'm genuinely proud of? Not proud in a performance sense, but proud in the sense that it reflects who I am trying to be. What did I do today that I want to do differently tomorrow? And what do I need in the next 12 hours? Rest, connection, solitude, movement, to show up well for tomorrow. The last question is the one most often skipped. We are better at assessing what we did than at honestly identifying what we need. But the identification of genuine need and the willingness to meet it without guilt is the maintenance practice of a recovering life. The person who consistently knows what they need and consistently meets those needs is a person who is unlikely to arrive at rock bottom again. The long arc. Recovery is not linear. This is stated so often that it has become a cliché, and clichés are the most dangerous form of truth. True enough to nod at, familiar enough to not actually absorb. So let me say it differently. You will have days deep into your rebuilding when it will feel like the rebuilding has not happened. When the weight returns. When the old thoughts arrive with their old certainty. When the distance between where you are and where you thought you would be by now feels as large as it ever did. Those days are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of nonlinearity, of the fact that growth and recovery do not travel in a straight upward line, but in a spiral, circling back through familiar territory at successively higher altitudes. The spiral means you will sometimes feel like you are back where you started. You are not. You are visiting the same coordinates from a different elevation. The view is different, even when the feeling is familiar. What you do with those days, whether you take them as evidence that recovery is impossible or as evidence that recovery is a practice rather than an achievement, is one of the most consequential choices available to you. Take them as practice. Return to the practice. The practice is patient with you. Fall down 7 times. Get up 8. The getting up is the whole art. Japanese proverb. You have already gotten up more times than you know. The fact of your presence here, reading these words, still engaged with the project of your own life, is evidence of a resilience that has been operating in you since before you named it. You have been getting up. You have been trying. You have been moving, even on the days it felt like standing still. That is the daily practice of becoming. Not a performance. Not a transformation completed in the past tense. A direction, chosen every morning, rechosen at noon, confirmed in the evening. A direction called forward. Called better than yesterday. Called still here, still trying, still unbroken. That is enough. On most days, that is everything. Practical tools for the journey. A reference for when you need it most. The following tools are not prescriptions. They are options, practices that have demonstrated effectiveness across different types of recovery and different people. Take what is useful. Leave what isn't. Return to this section on the hard days. Tool 1. The containment exercise. When intrusive thoughts about the collapse, the replays, the what-ifs, the shame spirals, become overwhelming during the day, the containment exercise provides a structured way to acknowledge them without being consumed by them. Choose a specific time window each day, 20 minutes, no more. That is the designated time for those thoughts. When they arrive outside that window, acknowledge them directly. I see you. I will give you your time at chosen time. Not now. Then redirect attention to the present task. At the designated time, sit with the thoughts fully for the allotted period. Then close the session with a deliberate transitional act. A breath, a brief walk, a glass of water. That signals the end of the window. This practice serves two purposes. It prevents the thoughts from colonizing the entire day, and it demonstrates, through repeated practice, that you have more agency over those thoughts than they feel like they allow you. They are not the governor of your attention. You are. Tool 2. The gratitude audit, the real version. Not the gratitude list of self-help cliché. 3 things you're grateful for, quickly noted, quickly forgotten. A genuine gratitude audit is more demanding and more rewarding than that. Once per week, identify one specific thing that is better today than it was 6 months ago. Not better than before rock bottom. Better than 6 months in a rock bottom. This is a deliberately modest horizon. 6 months ago, this specific thing was in a worse state. Today, it is in a better state. Name it concretely. Not things are better, but I am sleeping 5 hours instead of 3, or I have had 3 honest conversations about how I'm doing instead of 0, or I made the payment that I couldn't make 6 months ago. The granularity is the point. The vague sense that things are marginally better is psychologically inert. The specific, concrete, named improvement is evidence. Evidence, accumulated weekly, builds the case against the lie that nothing is changing. Tool 3. The letter you'll write later. This is a practice drawn from the journaling research of James Pennebaker and the future self psychology of Hal Hershfield. At some point in the early stages of rebuilding, it doesn't have to be now, write a letter to yourself from 2 years in the future. The future self who writes the letter knows what happened in the recovery. They remember how hard it was in the period when you're reading this. They have context you don't have yet. Write from that position, not prescriptively, not with the false certainty of knowing exactly what will happen, but with the warmth and honesty of someone who came through something and is writing back to the person who was in the middle of it. Then seal the letter. Put it somewhere you will find it in 2 years. When you find it, read it. The person you were when you wrote it, frightened, uncertain, just beginning to rebuild, will speak to you with a specificity and intimacy that no other document in your life can match. And the letter they wrote, if it was written honestly, will contain a kind of mercy, the mercy of someone who survived what you were surviving and is telling you that you can too. Tool 4. The 2-minute reach out. On the days when isolation is loudest, when the impulse to withdraw into the silence of your own crisis is strongest, the 2-minute reach out is a minimum viable connection, not a deep conversation, not a vulnerable disclosure, a text or a brief call that simply establishes contact. I'm having a hard day. Not looking for advice, just didn't want to be alone with it. That is the entire message. 2 minutes. A human being receives it, knows you are real and present and trying, and responds with their own reality. The connection is brief. Its effect on the nervous system, on the biological loneliness that isolation produces, is disproportionate to its length. The days you least want to reach out are the days you most need to. The resistance to connection in moments of crisis is the shame talking. It is not reliable guidance. Do it anyway. Tool 5. The progress map. Get a piece of paper. Not a screen, paper, because the physical act of writing engages spatial memory differently than typing. Draw a rough timeline from the day of the collapse to today. Mark the moments that were hardest. Mark the moments that were, in any degree, better. Mark the help that arrived and from where. Mark the decisions that turn out to be turning points, however small they seemed at the time. Look at it. This is not a route you imagined or planned. It is the route you actually traveled. The route contains valleys you survived and hills you climbed and unexpected turns that led somewhere you couldn't see for where you started. It is evidence, physical, spatial, undeniable evidence, that you have been moving, even when moving felt like standing still. The progress map is not for anyone else to see. It is for you, on the days when the progress is invisible. On those days, look at the map. The progress is not invisible. It is documented. It is real. These tools are not magic. They are practice. They work because they are done consistently, not because they are done perfectly. Begin where you are. Use what helps. Return to the rest when you are ready. Closing words. You are not behind. You are right on time. There is a particular cruelty that rock bottom inflicts that does not get enough attention. The sense that you are behind. Behind where you should be. Behind where you were. Behind your peers, your aspirations, your own previous timeline. The sense that while everyone else's life was moving forward in the normal way, you're stalled or moved backward. And the gap between you and them and where you wanted to be is now impossibly large. I want to address this directly and honestly because it is one of the most painful and one of the most factually incorrect beliefs that rock bottom produces. You're not behind. There is no schedule. There never was a schedule. There was only the story you were told about what a successful life is supposed to look like at each age and each stage, and rock bottom has disrupted that story. The disruption is real. The story was never as universal or as obligatory as it felt. Some of the most important lives in human history were, by conventional metrics, behind at exactly the points that mattered most. J.K. Rowling published her first book at 32, broke, single, on welfare. Vera Wang didn't design her first dress until she was 40. Morgan Freeman didn't break through as an actor until his 50s. Julia Child didn't publish her first cookbook until she was 49. Stan Lee created his first famous superhero at 39. These are not stories of people who made it despite the late start. The late start was part of the story. The circuitous route, the failures, the years of what looked from the outside like falling behind. These produced the specific depth, the specific perspective, the specific urgency that made what came after possible. The oak sleeps in the acorn. The bird waits in the egg. And in the highest vision of the soul, a waking angel stirs. Dreams are the seedlings of realities. James Allen. What you have been through has not wasted your time. It has spent your time on something. On the development of empathy that comfort does not produce. On the clarification of what you actually value as opposed to what you thought you valued. On the discovery of reserves of endurance you did not know you had. On the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of what it feels like to be at the bottom. Knowledge that will make you more useful, more present, more real to every person you encounter who is standing where you stood. Your story is not behind schedule. It is on its own schedule, unfolding in a way that your particular life was always going to unfold. Not the clean, linear, conventional way, but the real way. The complicated, painful, occasionally beautiful, genuinely yours way. You are not the rubble. You are the building that the rubble becomes. You are unbreakable. Not because nothing can hurt you, things already have, but because you are here, still reading, still trying to understand, still, on some level, choosing to believe that what comes next is worth building toward. That choice, made in the dark, without evidence, without guarantees, without any promise that it will be easy, is the most courageous thing a human being can do. You've already done it. You're doing it right now. Keep going. End. A note on sources and research. This book draws on decades of research from multiple disciplines: clinical psychology, neuroscience, sociology, addiction medicine, trauma theory, and the emerging field of post-traumatic growth. The following thinkers, researchers, and practitioners have most significantly shaped its contents. Brené Brown's research on shame and vulnerability, developed over more than 2 decades at the University of Houston, forms the backbone of the chapters on shame and disclosure. Her findings on the relationship between empathy and shame resilience are among the most practically important in modern psychology. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, first published in 1946, remains the most searching account of human resilience under extremity ever written. His concept of logotherapy, the idea that the primary human drive is not pleasure or power, but meaning, permeates this book's approach to recovery. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun's research on post-traumatic growth, developed at the University of North Carolina, provides the scientific foundation for the claim that suffering can produce genuine psychological growth rather than merely scar tissue. James Pennebaker's research on expressive writing and disclosure has been replicated across cultures, ages, and types of trauma. His finding that putting difficult experiences into language produces measurable health benefits is one of the most robust in psychological science. Matthew Lieberman's research on affect labeling, the brain science of naming emotions, grounds the book's approach to naming what is happening as the first step in managing it. Bronnieware's work in palliative care, collected in the top 5 regrets of the dying, provides a perspective that no amount of theoretical reasoning can replicate. The view from the end, looking back. Every story in this book, including the composite story of Marcus, reflects the documented patterns of real recovery. The specific details are constructed, but the shape of the story is true. That is the best thing a story can be. You are not alone in this. You never were.